Lee, I would add one other thing about just the clinical leader. And, this is something that I was reflecting on myself when we were at the Senior Leadership Forum, because I was giving this lecture about like how to be effective as a clinical leader, because we can carry the weight of having somebody die of sepsis, or looking at sepsis mortality and understanding that there are people dying at the sharp end of this. And there's nothing I can do about it today, because I don't have the credibility. I haven't built the relationships. I don't understand the scope of the problem. And I have this, I use sepsis because I'll go back to one other story. I was brand new to a hospital, and I was sitting at the first board meeting, and our sepsis mortality was terrible. And I remember the CEO turning to me and going, "Fix it." And I was like, dude, I was like, nobody knows who I am. I can't do anything here. And it took me a year to really start to make a dent in that sepsis mortality, because I had to build up the relationships, I had to understand the problem, and I had to figure out how we were going to move a medical staff to behave differently.
Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and along with a fabulous team at the CMO Group, we bring you the most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership. The CMO Group is the only physician-run and physician-led organization focused on chief medical officers and exists to transform how physicians lead. The group helps CMOs and emerging physician leaders move from expert operators to enterprise leaders through a unique transformational process. Healthcare doesn't only need good doctors and leadership, it needs high-powered executives with deep medical knowledge. That transformation is the work of the CMO Group. Today's guest is Dr. Nick Testa, Chief Clinical Officer at Sentact. Dr. Testa earned his undergraduate degree at Middlebury College before earning his medical degree from New York Medical College. He then completed a transitional internship at Harbor-UCLA Medical Center in 2002, followed by an emergency medicine residency at LA County USC Medical Center in 2005. Over the course of his clinical leadership career, Dr. Testa has served as Associate Medical Director at LA County USC Medical Center, Chief Medical Officer at Providence St. Joseph Medical Center, Chief Physician Executive at Dignity Health, and most recently, Regional Chief Medical Officer for all of California while at CommonSpirit Health. Throughout his career, Dr. Testa has had a keen interest in teaching undergraduates, medical students, residents in the areas of patient safety, quality, process improvement, and physician leadership. Today, Dr. Testa advances that same passion across hospitals and health systems as Chief Clinical Officer at Sentact, a company that helps hospitals and healthcare leaders identify problems early, improve patient safety, and strengthen the overall culture of care. The company combines technology, analytics, credentialing, peer review, rounding, and safety reporting tools so physician leaders and CMOs can better understand what is happening across their healthcare organizations and make smarter operational decisions. In simple terms, Sentact helps healthcare organizations see clearly where risks, communication gaps, or quality issues exist, then gives leaders practical ways to improve in alignment with their real-world clinical workflows. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. There's a lot we have to talk about, but I would like to start a bit at the beginning. You went way up in the physician leadership universe and hospital life, and now you're with Sentact. So I really think the listeners are probably curious, how did that begin? How did you end up with Sentact, and how did this all come to pass?
Yeah, it started out of curiosity. I was an emergency physician, and that's what I wanted to be, and I still identify as being an emergency physician. That's what I imagined my life to be. I had this unique opportunity when I graduated to stay at LA County USC as academic faculty. And when you're new academic faculty, everybody has to do something that nobody else wants to do. And the thing that I do was quality improvement. So when I was told by the vice chief, like, you're going to be the quality improvement director back in 2005, I went immediately up to my little cubicle and Googled quality improvement and what is a core measure. I didn't know anything. But what I really quickly learned was that I was really fascinated by the data that was coming out of the department. And I was also really enjoying teaching. And I found that I could marry those two things together and provide context to data. So we could talk about the academics behind necrotizing fasciitis, but then I could also show how many necrotizing fasciitis cases we were having in the department, what were the outcomes looking like, what were the conflicts that were going on between medicine and surgery, and then let's talk about the literature about necrotizing fasciitis and antibiotic choices. So I found this really interesting synergistic crossroads, and that ended up getting me recognized at the hospital level. I became the associate medical director at the hospital over the quality improvement program at the county hospital. And that was just an incredible 7-year fellowship, really, in learning how hospitals work, but then also how publicly reported data works, how safety works, how process improvement works. And then I chose very sort of deliberately to leave the county setting, not because I didn't love public health care. I really, really take great pride in the county, and I worked clinically there for years. I just wanted to take a risk and try something different. I felt like if I stayed at that one environment, I was going to be there forever. And so I left and joined and became the chief medical officer at St. Joe's in Burbank. That was my first true chief medical officer job. And completely different environment, community hospital, no academic programs. They didn't even have an EMR at the time I came on board. So I got to bring on an EMR. I got to bring on a hospitalist program and see how a community hospital works. And then from there, I was recruited to Dignity as a regional chief medical officer over Southern California. So I had 6 hospitals. That was my first exposure in getting to learn how do you not actually function within the walls of the hospital, but how do you help chief medical officers do their job? So I had this opportunity to design the chief medical officer job description, really look at what that role looks like and then standardize it. And then Dignity and CommonSpirit, or CHI, merged, became CommonSpirit. And then I was just very fortunate as they consolidated regions to become the chief medical officer over the whole state, which taught me about how do you manage 29 hospitals over a very large footprint. The key focus that I developed through that time was that chief medical officers were getting pulled in 50 different directions. You could show up, right, at 7 a.m. and have your day completely full, leave there at 9 p.m. and realize that you didn't actually do one thing outside of deal with a physician who was angry in the emergency department, or resources that couldn't be found in the ICU, or sit in a bunch of meetings. Yet really what were you doing? So what I worked on was to develop sort of this blueprint for my chief medical officers, which focused on what is healthcare? Like when you show up, you're there to improve healthcare. So what are you doing to do that? And it really fell into 4 key buckets. What are you doing to be safe? What are you doing to make the hospital high quality? What are you doing to improve patient experience? And what are you doing to be efficient? And that became the cornerstone of everything I did. I got the opportunity about 2 years ago to work with Sentact, and many of those values and principles that I was pursuing became woven into the fabric of Sentact. So when the company hit critical mass about a year ago, they really needed a chief medical officer, or chief clinical officer. And so I chose at that point to say, let me try another risk in my career. And because this is really matching my passions. And so I jumped over to Sentact and joined them as a full-time chief clinical officer.
What an amazing journey. And for our aspiring CMOs and our younger listeners, you just displayed the attributes of leadership, whether you realize it or not. And I have to point them out because I know my audience. You have to have curiosity. And that happened to you very, very, very early in your career. Hey, what do we have here? And what do we not know about what we have here? And how do we put all this together in a better way? That's a critical feature of being a strong leader, is to always have that curiosity. The second is you began to formulate this vision right then and there. Like, how could we do better? And everything you just said was about, well, how can we do this better? How can the CMOs do better? How can I do better by the CMOs? How can I redirect? And the title of this podcast is The Fire Chief, because as a CMO, that's what you are basically all day, every day. But we want to get above that and get to the fire marshal level, which is kind of where you are now. And obviously, you're willing to take risk. Now, maybe that's part of the genotype and phenotype of being an emergency room physician. You have to be a little bit like that, wired like that to do it. But a leader has to understand risk and be tolerant of risk. And a lot of people are risk averse, particularly in medicine. That's just the way we've been trained for all of the right reasons. So brilliant story. I want to shift a little bit and talk about sort of the mission statement a little bit about Sentact, reimagining the path to exceptional care. That's on the website. And I really want you to explain, what would a CMO find available to them when they start to dive into what you have?
Yeah. So when we talk about reimagining that path, it comes back to that, firstly, that concept of what is healthcare. So if you're going to improve something, you need to know what it actually is and be able to define it. And that definition is it is safe, it is high quality, and it is an excellent patient experience, and it is done efficiently. So all of the products that we have developed at Sentact fall into one of those categories. Now, if you were to go back, I'm not going to go through all the different permutations of names. Sentact was multiple different companies smaller companies that have come together to leverage their strength. You'd find that we had pieces of it. But really where we hit critical mass is where we had actual services that allow chief medical officers to do their job better. And so from a safety standpoint, we have a PSO. So we have one of the largest PSOs in the United States, and we allow chief medical officers and hospitals to submit their data in a protected way, thanks to the Patient Safety Act. And then we can aggregate the data. We can reflect that back to you and talk about what are you seeing trends-wise, but not only for you, but what are you seeing at other hospitals? But that's actually not the superpower of the PSO. Where we really leverage the strength is we bring together all of our members so that they have opportunities to learn from each other. Because somebody who is struggling with falls at one hospital, the solution is actually living at another hospital down the road or in another state. So we bring those connections together. We do collegial collaborations every week. We do legal briefs. We have a couple lawyers we work very closely with so they understand sort of the risk associated with safety. We just do a lot of stuff to bring our members together. If you look at our quality work, we have a peer review platform that we've developed. So many of us have struggled with, and I hate to even say these words, 4 letters out loud, OPPE, right? Everyone has gone down the path of trying to make the better OPPE system. I'm not going to say we've solved it, but we utilize unique data sets to provide more accurate and complete data around our physicians so that we get better pictures of quality, and we work on a proprietary measure set so that we can provide you information not only about the physicians at your hospital, but about your physician at your hospital and then how he or she looks at the hospital down the road and at other hospitals. So we have a much wider data set that many people don't have access to. From a patient experience standpoint, our Sentact rounding platform is really best in breed. So every single physician, nurse, leader develops a certain distance from the bedside that we all feel uncomfortable with. Rounding is the solution to close that gap. And if we really want to change our patient experience culture, it has to do with leaders being at the bedside, talking to patients. We have an accountability tool so that physicians, nurse leaders can round. They can either hold it on their hands or they can go back to their computer and fill out their questions so you can start to aggregate what your patients are seeing. And then you can start to do tactical rounding. So we know that 4 South is that spot where we need to round. Well, who's rounding there? Well, who's assigned? And then from a regulatory and compliance standpoint, we really are best in breed in physician credentialing. So we do a lot of work around, we have a CVO, and then we also do a lot of our staffing work is to support med staff offices to do better physician credentialing. So those are just some examples. We're bringing that all together under one roof. We're the only place, in my opinion, and I'm always hesitant to say this, but because this is a CMO podcast, I'll say it here. We're the only place where we are a one-stop shop for chief medical officers. Now, I'm a chief clinical officer deliberately because the truth is outcomes are driven not by only the CMO. We've got to engage the CNOs. You've got to engage EVS, food and nutrition. It's really the whole diaspora of the hospital, but we really are a one-shop stop for CMOs.
I love the fact that you are thinking so clearly about what a CMO needs in terms of a one-stop shop. And all I'm thinking is the minute you said OPPE, I'm thinking, where have you been all of my life? Why weren't you available to me about 6 or 7 years ago when I so desperately needed your menu of opportunities? I mean, this is fantastic. You're very lucky to be in this role. And I think CMOs that are thinking about these things are very wise to begin to consider everything you offer. In addition to everything you just mentioned, is there any other way that you believe that you stand apart from any other medical staff related services, standards, care delivery? I mean, I think you are the only shop that offers what you have, but maybe there's more to the story.
I think that we offer, in a world where everyone's looking for a technology solution, we have embraced technology, but we also have human solutions. So we have a large consulting arm. We have the largest external peer review program in the country. So like when you encounter that neurosurgical case because you have that one neurosurgeon or you only have 2 neurosurgeons and you need to send that case out, we have a really deep bench of external peer reviewers who are really best in breed. We also will take that a step further when we identify a set of cases, and this happens where, this is the seventh case you're sending us on this physician. Maybe the problem isn't just the physician. Maybe the problem is how you're closing the loop with the physician. And so we've become quite talented at, we don't do it with lawyers. We have a group of physicians, several of which have sat on and chaired the Colorado Medical Board, to come in and sit with the CEO and sit with the medical staff and say, here's what your bylaws say, and this is what you're not doing. And we need to do the hard work of moving this physician towards better. And what does that look like? And so we'll provide that level of consulting. We also provide staffing for med staff offices. And that is an area that I'm super excited about, because while the work that's done in the med staff office is so important, and I really do believe we're best in breed there, we're expanding that work to also provide staffing to safety, quality, and other areas to really match the technology and analytic services. So that's where I think we're really different. If you look at, and I don't, there's a lot of competitors out there. If you look at the work that they're doing, it's really about like, what's the new tech solution? And I think it's all important. But in the day of AI, we really don't know what the tech and analytics are going to look like 5 years from now. But hospitals are never going to get away from needing human to human interaction. That's what we do for a living.
Yeah, I've had my own scar tissue develop over external peer review when I was a chief medical officer, and having a body of physician leader experts who can weigh in, not tell you what to do, but say, look, here's a best practice, or here's how our team would look at how you're developing the work that you're doing. Because if you're not careful, for all of you out there right now that are in the midst of some kind of fair hearing or peer review, and you have external peer reviewers on the table for discussion, this has to be handled in the best manner possible, or your case will go sideways. And that's not good for you, for the physicians involved, everybody who's volunteering their time. So I think that is really a remarkable service. And I would endorse that if people looking for some human connectivity, sounds like Dr. Nick has got that for you at Sentact with his crew. So all of this is happening, and I'm going to change the conversation a little bit.
Uh-huh.
As all of this sort of traditionally separate medical staff level elements sort of exist in a disparate way, how would you articulate to a chief medical officer? And you've done a nice job in both an elegant and eloquent fashion of the 4 pillars by which Sentact thrives. But at the end of the day, if you were just talking to a CMO, like, what's in it for them to consider the value proposition that you're talking about? Like the sort of the bottom line for them, if they're scratching their head, do I or don't I do it this way or a different way?
Yeah, I think that the value proposition starts small. I think we all identify that we have an issue with, I need someone to staff my medical staff office, or I need external peer review, or I need someone to come in and educate my medical staff about how they are supposed to function as a medical staff, right? Those basic things that sometimes fall by the wayside. It starts small, and that's what we're there for. So we have a lot of very small relationships. And what we've found, though, is that those grow through partnership and trust. So once you know who we are, what we can provide, then it opens the door to say, oh, you know what? I actually think we would like to be in a PSO. And so then we have a PSO partner. And then when we say, well, we have a rounding partner, but they really haven't worked for us. Well, we have a rounding solution. So, to be frank, I think all listen, yes, have I turned into a businessman in healthcare? Yes, I get it. I would like to come in and you to come in and buy every single one of my products. But I just don't think that's how it works in healthcare. The best vendors, and I get it. I'm on the other side of the fence now. I'm a vendor. But the best relationships start with trust. And that trust is started through small transactions that grow into validated partnerships. And I mean, listen, prove us out. If it works for you, great. But I think what works for us is that we provide really, really good service and partnership where the chief medical officer, the chief nursing officer, and other leaders at the hospital need us.
You just uncovered a truism in the physician universe that applies to those that are in physician leadership roles. And that is, and you know this as well as anybody, when you're in the emergency department and something bubbles up and you got to pick up the phone and call someone, there are certain people you would prefer to call over
Yeah.
others. Not that the others are worse, but you have a better relationship. You trust them. They've done things for you that you thought that was great. And so trust amongst physicians,
Mhm.
look, that it's just a hidden language that we have. And you always turn to your other buddy and say, who would you go to if
Right.
you had a heart condition or so on? And
Sure.
that's how physicians talk to each other. And I think you're spot on that. Prove us wrong. Check us out. We have a variety of opportunities. Get to know us, and we've integrated. So as you grow and your thoughts grow, you provide. I think that's very insightful and a very smart way to do that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you.
What might be some blind spots that have occurred for chief medical officers that are in those traditional models, by which someone who is now just beginning to ponder this might get that quick win by reaching out to you and your team?
So the first thing I see is that so many chief medical officers are very good physicians who have built up great reputations at the hospital, who end up in the CMO role, but have no real experience in being a physician leader. And they flounder because they don't really know what they're supposed to do. And that's why I came up with that sort of approach to healthcare, because I had these new CMOs who would come in and the question was like, what do I work on? Like, first and foremost, you work on safety, and then you work on quality, and then experience, right? Like there's a formula to this. But I think that that's a real threat to the physician leader. And if you look at throughout the house of medicine, nurses have a really extraordinary pyramid to promote through, right? They start at the bedside clinically, and then they get more responsibility as a unit leader, and then as a nursing manager and a nursing director, and then they can eventually can become chief nursing officer. And there's a graduated growth. Physicians don't have that. If you're a good emergency physician, guess what you get to do is see more patients and maybe not work as many night shifts. I mean, yes, there are a few medical director positions, but they don't have the same sort of ascension to leadership. Where I think we can actually sort of change that paradigm is we do quite a bit of education around teaching chiefs of staff and CMOs how to do your job better. We just had our senior leadership forum. This is our second one we did back in April in Colorado, and with the goal really to bring in chiefs of staff and CMOs so that they can better learn how to do their job. And that's really where it starts, is just understanding the role of the chief medical officer. I have a whole lecture I give around understanding the roles of the chief of staff and the chief medical officer, because I think sometimes they just get blurry and people don't understand it. So that's a long answer to your question, is where does it start? It starts out learning what the job actually is.
Yeah, no, look, I ask long questions, so you're entitled to give long answers. That's how we roll here on the podcast. Let me ask you, are there any specific sort of case studies or examples of how, a year or two later down the road, a CMO comes back to you and says, I just want to tell you a little bit about what's happened since we began to work with you. Any stories come to mind?
Well, I remember I've only been at Sentact as it stands now for 4 months, but I do have one story that really landed with me. So I give a lecture about improving quality and outcomes, and I always reference back to the role of the chief medical officer is to improve healthcare, and healthcare is defined as safety, quality, experience, and utilization. That's what we're focusing on, and that's hierarchical. And you shouldn't go to one until you figure out the next one. And there's logic to this. And so I gave that lecture at our senior leadership forum. And like every physician leader who attends one of those things, they're multitasking. So they're listening, and then they're also texting. They're going back up to their room to do work. We know everyone's been to a conference. We know how it rolls, right? And so the last day of the conference, one of the participants pulls me aside and goes, I just wanted you to know that after your lecture, I went back upstairs and I rewrote my whole board report. It all made sense to me how I was going to present to the board. So I just wanted to thank you. And like moments like that for me, as someone who's been a chief medical officer for 20 years, lands in a way that nothing else does. So
yeah, that'll fill a bucket in a drop. That's just fantastic. Yeah. No, I think that's a great story, and maybe we'll bring you back in about 6 to 12 months, and you'll have about a dozen more stories to share.
I hope so.
Tell us a little bit more about the Senior Medical Leaders Forum. Sort of what was the genesis, what you hope to get out of it, what the CMOs get out of it. Just fill us in a little bit more about that experience.
So the first version of this occurred last year, and it was really a natural progression from the work that we were doing. We were already engaging with senior physician leaders, particularly around our our staffing and our external peer review. So we said, we should do a forum. We got to put our flag on that beach and say, we not only can go to your hospital and educate, but we can bring people together and educate. And so we did the first version last year, which was quite successful, but small. We've aimed to curate this to only be about 50 people. Last year, I think we had 25 or 30. This year, we had to cut off registration. We got to 50. And, I did a survey on the first day just to see who was there. And it was a 50-50 split between chief medical officers and chiefs of staff, which is exactly what we were looking for. There was a few developing medical directors too. And there was a couple med staff office directors, which I really appreciated being there because they were so valuable to the breakout conversations. But the spirit of it is on day one, we do the fundamentals of physician leadership. So this is kind of our consulting program. So we will go to a hospital. We'll go over what does the med staff or structured med staff look like. Let's talk about credentialing. Let's talk about peer review. These are the main elements that you need to know as your responsibility to the board. That is pretty much universal. That's table stakes, right? That gets everybody in the game. That day is actually optional. The real program starts on the Monday. And what we do for the next 2.5 days is really a combination of what's going on across healthcare right now. And then also what are some of the nuanced characteristics of physician leadership that you should know. And then finally, who are you and how are you going to grow into this position? So I'll give you some examples. I do a survey on how do you improve? So what's the strategy around, being a clinical leader and improving versus anyone else? We had someone coming in talking about what are the current state of quality measures. Then we get to some sort of more subtle topics. I talk about psychological safety. One of my colleagues talks about emotional intelligence, leading through critical decisions. We talk a lot about physician wellness, the role of the CMO and the chief of staff in physician wellness, physician well-being. And then we do quite a bit of career development work. Everyone does a DISC survey, so they get to learn about what is their leadership style. One of my good friends comes in and speaks about what does the future you look like? So you're going down this path, but why? Did you accidentally end up here? Did you intentionally end up here? But whatever you're in physician leadership, where are you going next? And then we do a lot of breakouts and sort of small groups and a lot of collaborative work. So it's very curated and it's very high touch. And what we found from our feedback was the lecturers don't come in for a day and then breeze out. The lecturers are all sitting there at the tables with everybody. So we go to dinner together, we socialize. So I had a lot of people coming up to me being like, hey, I have this problem. You've been doing this for 20 years. How would you take this problem on? And so it's not like any conference I've been to that does physician leadership.
I love it. I have been to many of these more out of exploration. And what you just described might be the very first time I ever heard anybody spend even a minute on psychological safety.
Oh, yeah, that's a big topic for me.
It is. And look, you go to these meetings and people tell you all about the architecture, the org chart, how medical staff functions, bylaws, rules, regs, OPI, FIPI, the whole 9 yards. I get it. You get it. If you're new to it, it's like a deer in headlights. But then somebody starts talking about leadership competencies and skill sets that you're developing. So I think this is just the smartest way I've heard a CMO forum be put together. And there are a few others like yours, but most of them are vendor managed and vendor related. And so while you call yourself a vendor, you're not really on the dark side. If you work for an insurance company, most of us would call you on the really, really dark side. And that's another topic for another day. And I have no beef with that either. So look, I do want to ask you one really important question before we begin to wrap up around psychological safety. Mm-hmm. So we're still stuck in this nomenclature of peer review, and you described an incredible amount of analytic work that you're building, which the last time I talked to you, I think I shared with you, I think that this is something that AI can support. Yeah. More data about quality improvement, and is less about peer review and more about QI. Uh-huh. Your rate is just slightly off of this thing we're measuring. And if we could move that rate, you're providing more quality or more safety. And it's not like we're going to sit around and basically smack talk you down. That's the old peer review, and everybody gets all jiggity about it. So, as you think about psychological safety, what might be some of the ways to draw accountability with less of that traditional friction and fears? And how deep did you guys talk about that, and what might you be thinking for the future relative to psychological safety?
So I'd like to tell a story about, there's a lot to unpack and a lot of directions we could go in based on that question that you just shared. But there's a story that I like to share about how I sort of stumbled into psychological safety. And so I've done a lot of work in high reliability. It's one of my sort of passion areas. And when I was over the entire state for a CommonSpirit, I rolled out high reliability. And I shouldn't say I rolled it out. In many hospitals, it had already been rolled out, but I normalized the activities of high reliability. So the way that it was happening in hospital A was the same that was happening in hospital B. And one of the key things that I focused on was how are you analyzing your events? How are you really looking at an event? And how are you classifying it and quantifying it, and then obviously what are you doing about it? And what I found was that many hospitals were not having event review committees. They weren't doing it on any sort of regular basis. So we normalized that. And everyone had to report to me to a level of accountability that they were reviewing events every month. And so I would meet with all 29 hospitals and I would say, hey, when did you meet last? Oh, usually it was the day before we were meeting. You'd have this rolls, but they still met. And then I'd be like, okay, how many cases did you review? We didn't review any cases. I don't believe you. There's something wrong there. You need to go back and make sure you're missing something. So we would challenge them, but it was always in this very, you got this kind of way. Like, it's not bad. I've sat in your seat. I know what you're doing. We all know what you're doing. I know you're busy, but let's figure out a way to make this a priority if we're really going to make safety a priority. And so they'd start to bring compelling cases. And then we'd see hospital A was considering CLABSIs and CAUTIs a trigger, but then hospital B wasn't. So how can you compare them? So, okay, well, then we need to normalize this. So then we had everyone look at CLABSIs and CAUTIs. And then after about a year of doing this, what we saw was that our harm events quadrupled. So all of a sudden, I'd spent a year working on safety, and I had 4 times the number of harm events than any other region in CommonSpirit. So I had to tell everyone, like, hey, listen, just be patient. That's supposed to happen. What's supposed to happen is when we focus on safety and people feel comfortable reporting, and we've also normalized it and explained it, and they know that we're not going to get fired or penalized, then people are going to start bringing forward really important stuff for us to talk about. And so we saw that a 4 times jump. And then over the next 18 months, we saw it slowly decrease. And so I share that because that's the story that I usually use to start off the conversation about psychological safety. If you look at any of the sort of anchor work in healthcare and psychological safety, it comes back to Amy Edmondson. Amy Edmondson, if you haven't read her work, really sort of not the first work on psychological safety, but sort of the most recent word on it in healthcare. And if you look at her PhD thesis on psychological safety, it goes back to observation in the OR. And her hypothesis was the high-functioning OR team should have less harm events. And what she found was the high-functioning OR teams had more harm events. And it was because of psychological safety and a team's willingness to feel comfortable reporting and speaking up about what was truly happening. So I share all that with you just to tell that anecdote, because the change actually comes not from we implemented this program or I bought this widget. The change comes for how humans interact with each other and how leaders aren't scared to hear about the unfortunate perinatal case, right? And how we're not going to start snapping at people because you had another retained foreign body. But you ask the question of, what are we going to do next? And are you okay? And how's your team handling this, right? It's just, once you change that climate in healthcare as a leader, all of a sudden you start learning what's really happening. And you find that people step up and become accountable because they want to deliver something to you because you gave them something.
Yeah, it's a great story. You tap into the purpose why we choose healthcare, right? To do something better. And if you create the environment where everybody feels safe speaking up, you're going to do better. And it's counterintuitive to the doctor, or the CMO, that these safety events or the reports or both the reporting and the events go up because that it just doesn't add up. But think about lead time bias and all the great advances in radiographic imaging. We start to find things earlier,
right?
And that's what we're trying to do. And then we have to sort out, okay, that was benign. Don't cut. Don't do anything. That one we need to address. I think that you're onto something, and it goes back to what you said earlier in the podcast. You're bringing the human connection in a very clunky world we live in, a disconnected world. A lot of people are praying about the tech and the AI, and it's going to have good things and wonky things, but to bring the humans together for the discernment, the
Yeah.
judgment, the safety, and the courage to speak up. That's how you make an impact. And I'll tell all the listeners, if you are tired of being a firefighter, even if you want to be the chief or the marshal, you've got to institute these principles that Dr. Nick is talking about. That's the beginning of moving up the ladder to being the most effective clinical leader in your organization, in my opinion.
Yeah. Lee, I would add one other thing about just the clinical leader. And, this is something that I was reflecting on myself when we were at the senior leadership forum, because I was giving this lecture about like how to be effective as a clinical leader. And I think one of the things that we forget is that we're clinical leaders and we're working with very smart, well-intentioned other leaders who have never stood at a patient's bedside. And that becomes so important because we can carry the weight of having somebody die of sepsis or looking at sepsis mortality and understanding that there are people dying at the sharp end of this. There's nothing I can do about it today because I don't have the credibility. I haven't built the relationships. I don't understand the scope of the problem. And I had this, I use sepsis because I'll go back to one other story. I was brand new to a hospital and I was sitting at the first board meeting and our sepsis mortality was terrible. And I remember the CEO turning to me and going, "Fix it." And I was like, dude, I was like, nobody knows who I am. I can't do anything here. And it took me a year to really start to make a dent in that sepsis mortality because I had to build up the relationships. I had to understand the problem and I had to figure out how we were going to move a medical staff to behave differently. And that weight of understanding that people aren't going to get better, a clinician has to carry that weight. It's very uncomfortable for somebody who's not a clinician to understand what that feels like. And I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you're a hematologist oncologist, right?
Yes.
And so you have to watch sometimes patients get sicker before they're going to get better. And sometimes they're not going to get better. And that's a weight a clinician, physician or nurse can shoulder in just a different way. And so I always remind my clinical leaders of that because that was such an important thing that I really hadn't dawned on me till recently, that concept of like clinical triage. Like that's what we have to do. And somebody who's never stood at a patient's bedside is going to have a harder time doing that.
Yeah. It's well stated. Well, my friend, this has been a fantastic show. Lots of great information. Before we wrap it up, any last words you want to offer up to any CMOs that are listening?
Two things. Firstly, I want to thank you, Lee. I have never in a million years thought I would be a chief medical officer. I signed up to be an emergency physician and go mountain biking in the middle of a week, right? And sit at a coffee shop on a Tuesday. And I still love emergency medicine. So to all my colleagues out there, thank you. But also thank you to you for actually acknowledging the chief medical officer and the role that we play in the hospital leadership team. You don't always see a chief medical officer there, right? Many hospitals don't have a CMO or they have a part-time CMO. So I thank you for elevating the position to a professional position. The second point I would make to my colleagues who are out there, and I'm going to say this because every single one of you wants to do this more, but you don't do it enough, is round. Get out and round on patients. Just get out of your office. And I know you like to do what I used to do, which is like, oh yeah, I round. Like I go down to the emergency department and like I talk to my two friends down there who I always like to see. And then I go up to the ICU, but like, no, like go and when everybody else is rounding and go walk into a patient's room and go talk to a patient about their experience and then bring that information back to Safety Huddle. It will generate stories for you that will be so critical to influencing change down the road.
I'm going to double down on that. I would advise you to begin your rounding, get familiar with it, and then do it on nights and on weekends when no one expects you to be
100%.
there. That's a game changer for you, your career, your credibility, and everybody that you work with. So I'm all in on what you said and great stuff for our listeners.
Thanks,
Well,
Lee.
thank you for being on the show and sharing all your passion with us. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. If you want to learn more about how to reimagine the path to exceptional care, then reach out to the fine folks at Sentact and connect with Dr. Nick Testa on LinkedIn. If you want to learn more about your own physician leadership development and how to transform yourself and become a CMO, then contact me and I'll set you up with the CMO group and take you through the transformation that you need to lead in healthcare. I love talking with CMOs from all over the world, even all the way from Los Angeles. So get out there, update your credentialing, your peer review, your rounding, your safety tools, use technology, analytics, whatever you've got, whatever you need, set up your medical staff for success. But whatever you do, remember, look out for yourself and be good to the others out there.